Hello, everyone, and welcome to Context. This program is brought to you by the Idaho Humanities Council with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The views expressed here today do not necessarily represent those of the IHC or the NEH. My name is Johanna Bringhurst, and joining us today is Dr. Rebecca Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz has served as a full-time professional in academia since 2008 and is currently the Dean of Academic Pathways for Columbia Gorge Community College. This month, she's taking on a new role as Vice President of Instruction at Blue Mountain Community College. A graduate of the University of Idaho, woohoo! With degrees in philosophy and international studies, she later earned her PhD in educational leadership and policy from the University of Utah. Her academic work centers on history of education, particularly as it relates to the 20th century in the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Schwartz has a particular interest in history as it relates to student success. Born in a rural area of northern Idaho characterized by lack of diversity, working internationally was a transformational experience for her. Since her return from Japan, she has worked at 5 higher education institutions. Rebecca, thank you for joining us today to talk about a little known area of World War II history in Idaho.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, in 1940, a Boise construction company called the Morrison Knudson Corporation won a contract to build military air base facilities on Wake Island in the South Pacific. This was a substantial construction contract under the National Defense Program. In 1941, hundreds of workers from southern Idaho sailed from San Francisco to join nearly 1,000 other workers on Wake Island. Morrison Knudson was a major employer here at that time. How big of a deal was this defense contract for Idaho?
It was a major deal. As you said, we had hundreds of workers. At one point, there was over 1,000. There was 1,100 people from Idaho on that island, and we're talking about a period in Idaho history where the population of Boise was 30,000 people. So 1,000 people from the Treasure Valley on a tiny island in the Pacific was huge. Everyone knew somebody that was going there. Everyone knew a family with a son or a husband or a cousin that was there. So it was a large economic boon for the area because everyone had these jobs, but it was also sort of exciting. We're all going to go do this work abroad and make this money and come back, and it's going to be, so good for Idaho.
Most people, I think, are familiar with the attack on Pearl Harbor, that day of infamy, December 8th, 1941. But Wake Island was also attacked the same day. Can you describe what happened?
Sure. So I think you're right. We all know the Pearl Harbor attack. It's a day that will live for infamy. And Wake Island wasn't really an attack. It was the Battle of Wake Island. The U.S. Naval Institute refers to it as the Massacre of Wake Island. So Pearl Harbor had much higher casualty rates. It had 2,500 people died, but it's an attack that lasted just over an hour and 15 minutes. Japan did this bombing raid of Hawaii, and we had this mass casualty event. Wake Island went on for weeks. It was this tiny island. There were no indigenous people there. It was rocks. There isn't even really like a lot of fresh water or resources on this island. It had a little bit of water and it had birds, and that was pretty much the entirety of it was there. But it had some strategic purposes, which is why they were building this military base. And some people talk about how it was the next day after Pearl Harbor because Wake Island's on the other side of the international date line. It was, as you said, just literally hours later that they first did a bombing campaign and then they did a naval assault on the island. And what was kind of fascinating is, as we said, there was over 1,100 contractors on the island. These are not military personnel. These are people working for Morrison Knudson. There was a couple of people for like an airline who were there, not military. There was only about 500 military personnel, but they when you're all in a foxhole, suddenly you're all military personnel. And when the Japanese tried to invade, they all picked up arms and defended it. It was referred to as the Alamo of the Pacific because you had the Japanese naval fleet, which remember just a couple decades earlier, they defeated Russia. The Japanese Navy was one of the most powerful military organizations in the world, and they were attacking this tiny island with 1,600 people on it, and still that tiny island was able to hold out for 2 weeks. And so they were eventually captured, though, and that's sort of where we come to the massacre of Wake Island.
Did the people on Wake Island know about the attack on Pearl Harbor? Were they aware of the broader context of what was happening?
Not in the immediacy. So they knew that there had been an attack. And again, the attack on Wake Island went on for several weeks. So they had communication. They were asking for help. They were asking for aid. And the attack was not a constant bombardment. It was waves. So they had bombers come in and bomb. Then they had the Navy try and do, again, ground invasions. And they had two of those try and happen. And in between those waves of attacks, the American forces were, calling for help, calling for aid, getting back and forth, having this communication with the U.S. government and their allies. And so everyone sort of knew what was happening, but no one quite knew what to do. So the U.S. was trying to send reinforcements. They tried to send both provisions and reinforcements. And it's sort of the best laid plans type scenario. They tried at least twice to send provisions. One, they sent a ship out and then called it back because they saw that Japan was sending another wave and they thought this one ship would just be going to the slaughter. And so they sent a bigger, like an armada, a whole force to go in and give supplies and reinforcements to the Wake Island. And they hit some rough weather. One of the supply ships was slower than anticipated, and it was supposed to arrive December 22nd, which was about 2 weeks after the start, and it was delayed. And on December 23rd is when Japanese were able to take Wake Island. And so then there was no reason to continue with the reinforcements, and they again returned.
So it sounds like the attack on Wake Island was probably more impactful to people in Idaho than what had happened in Pearl Harbor. Can you describe what it was like for people in Idaho learning about the news of Wake Island?
It absolutely was more impactful. Pearl Harbor was a devastating event in American history, obviously, but it was a naval base in which people from around the country were there. And so I think the entire country felt that attack sort of unilaterally. We all felt like we were attacked because the country was attacked in that spot. And it was a surprise, it was fast, and it was, again, a very, very high casualty rate. And so, again, we were all impacted. Wake Island, 2/3 of the people on it were from Idaho. Everyone knew someone there. And again, they could communicate. So the drama of this attack and sort of the danger of it, the whole experience was being relayed to people. It was on the news every night. So people in Idaho were hearing their loved ones, their families, their friends who were in danger. They were hearing, they're trying to send reinforcements there. And there was a little bit of propaganda in there too, that, these strong Americans are holding out against the forces of the Japanese. And like at one point, one of the leaders on Wake Island said, if you could send some supplies, that would be great. And he listed, like, we really need these supplies. But it got back to people that they reported it saying, if they would send us more Japs, we're ready for them. Because they were having these kind of discussions and promotional things. So the people in Idaho were waiting for news constantly of their family members, exactly what was going on. The same with people, in Pearl Harbor, waiting to hear if their loved ones were there. But it was an overwhelming sort of political and social and cultural shift in Idaho. Idaho is a state that was built on mining and forestry, which were always sort of areas that were unique. Like it had people who worked alone. It was really a good place for sort of like isolationist movements because you could do all these things, and so it wasn't the most uh, metropolitan state to begin with, and now we're being attacked by these people, and it really started a political discussion and sort of this growing um, feeling towards Japanese that really started to permeate the state at the time more than other states, as we'll see in the subsequent actions of the state, that the anti-Japanese sentiment that evolved from this was extreme.
Why did the Japanese attack Wake Island? I think you said it mostly was sand and birds.
It
So
was.
why?
So it had the one distinction of it, and that was it was a series of rocks and sand that were between Hawaii and Japan. And so remember, this is the 1940s. Planes needed a place to refuel. They couldn't make it that distance. And so they had sort of a review of the strategic importance. And the US had actually sort of annexed Wake Island 50 years previously in the late 1890s. And by the 1900s, Japan had recognized this is an island that belongs to the US. Everyone knew it was sort of this US territory, but nobody cared because there was nothing there. And it had a history of sort of like, at one point in, I think, the 1920s, a Japanese ship was injured in a storm and needed repairs. It just went to Wake Island and stayed there and recovered. They went there and hunted birds when they needed food. Other countries just kind of stopped at Wake Island because it was a series of rocks. It was a place to do repairs. It was a place to get fresh water, and it was uninhabited, so it was fine to be there. But when it became obvious that Japanese expansion was happening, the US didn't want them to take Wake Island because that would give them a foothold that put them closer to Hawaii, put them closer to the US mainland. And if they needed a place to refuel their planes or dock their own navy, it was a strategically important place. So it was actually ranked as the third priority in the Pacific. It was after Pearl Harbor, then Midway, then Wake Island was the most importantly strategic locations in the Pacific to the US.
How did the battle resolve itself? What happened in the end?
So the end took years to come about, even though it was only a 2 week battle. So the Japanese did invade, they did capture the island, and they captured the 1,600 people who were there. I always find it interesting that there, at that point, was a fairly low death toll, and it was almost even between Japanese soldiers and Americans who had died, which I always find that very fascinating because you have this giant military fighting a couple of people with guns, a couple of Idahoans in a trench were able to hold out. So it is a really a story of sort of the resilience of us. But at the end of the day, they were captured. Of the 1,600, most of them were shipped to POW camps elsewhere in the Pacific. Only about 360 stayed on the island, and they stayed, to not mince words, they stayed as slave labor primarily. The Geneva Convention wasn't honored by Japan. It didn't really even exist at this point. And they kept the people to do the work that they were already doing. They wanted them to build an airfield, but instead of building it for the US, they wanted to build it for Japan. They also wanted to reinforce Wake Island. They ended up bringing gun turrets and all sort of reinforcements to stave off any American invasions of the island that might come later. And so this, again, just pile of rocks became this major stronghold. And they kept these 360 people there to build those turrets, build the airlines, build all the parts to it.
So the workers who were kept on Wake Island, did they spend the remainder of the war there? What happened to them?
So not all of them spent the remainder of the war. Um, Several spent the remainder of their lives there, however. So several of them died within the next couple of months. The conditions were not good. They talk about how it's again an idea where the Japanese didn't know what they were going to do with Wake Island until they decided to build this. So for several days after they had successfully invaded, they had 1,600 prisoners of war, and they thought they were going to kill them all. That was the original thought, that we're going to execute all 1,600 of these people. And it wasn't until sort of the thought of, hey, these are skilled laborers who are doing this work. We could use them instead. Plus, there was pressure from the U.S. Don't kill all of our people, obviously. And so, even just during that decision time, that 2 or 3 days, this is December. It's kind of cold. It's rainy, and they're on a pile of rocks, and they're all outside. They talk about how they had to kneel in the gravel in the rain day and night while they waited to know what was going to happen to them. And at the end, they said, through the grace of the emperor, we are going to give you your lives. And no one knows if this is real, but reportedly one of the men shouted, "Well, thank the bastard for us." So they were, even after all of that, they, in theory, had good spirits, but they stayed on the island. 360 of them stayed on the island of the 1,600. The others were sort of shipped out to all these other POW camps, none of which had particularly lovely facilities or experiences, but the 360 were just slave labor. They were worked day and night primarily. There was a little bit of class difference because, like in all things, there were the people who knew how to work the equipment. There were the laborers. There were these men who could work with their hands, but then there were the managers, the people who were a little bit higher up in Morrison Knudson, who could talk a little better, could have a little bit of better connections, and were politically protected a little bit more. And even on Wake Island, they had slightly different experiences. So you saw the laborers again working day and night, literally worked to death sometimes, and slightly better treatment of officers, slightly better treatment of managers. But long term, in 1943, they moved the majority, I think it was about 260 prisoners off again. They moved them to other camps, and they left 96, 97 prisoners on to continue the work. Then there was one more volunteer. A doctor said, "I'm going to stay behind too and see to the medical needs of these men." And none of them survived. It was they, long story short, they are buried in a mass grave on Wake Island. In 1943, when it became obvious that Wake Island was no longer serving the strategic needs of Japan, they decided to abandon it. They lined up the men along the shore, they blindfolded them, they tied them up, and they sort of unceremoniously shot them and buried them. It gets worse. Because a day or so later, one of the Japanese soldiers said, "Hey, I think I saw somebody running away." And so they unburied all of them to count how many were there. And sure enough, one person was missing. And so they then did a search. And once again, this sort of nameless person, they think was in hiding on Wake Island for about 2 weeks until he too was found and beheaded and tossed into a grave. And to add sort of insult to injury, Japan, when they were asked like what happened to these people on Wake Island, their first report was they were killed in a bombing raid by US fighters. That US kept bombing us and it was so hard. And we tried to protect them. We put them all into an air raid shelter and it just took a direct hit and they were all wiped out. And it was oh so sad. And it wasn't until later that it was discovered that they had all been just unceremoniously executed.
Oh man.
Sorry, I
That's
should have put a warning on that story.
yeah, that is it's just heartbreaking to think about the families that were waiting for years to hear news.
Well, and it's heartbreaking to think about the men on the island for me. So you talk about families, some of them were families. So one of the workers on it, Wilcox, kept a diary, and Wilcox had been a soldier in World War I. And so even though he was no longer a soldier, he was a Morrison Knudson contractor. Um, he cared a lot about sort of the military aspects of what was going on, and he wanted there to be a record of the conditions they were experiencing. And it was very important to him that there also be a record of those who died. And literally every passage he put in every day, it's here's who passed away. And one of the most heartbreaking records from his diary for me is when he says, this person died. He survived only 5 days after the death of his son, because his son was also on the island with him. And so it's remember because they're not soldiers, they're workers, and it's really common for families to be in the same business. So you had people who were related, you had family members on the island, and in that particular family, that family lost their father, their son, and then their other son died just a few years later, in a crop dusting accident of all things. And so it was just nothing but tragedy for that family moving forward.
Yeah. Wow, thank you for sharing stories about specific families. Also, that is not something I had thought about before. What happened to the workers that were sent off the island that were put in POW camps?
So the POW camps are never good in any conflict. They aren't generally considered a vacation. I would say that the Japanese POW camps were exceptionally brutal, and these were no exceptions. But these people were not treated differently than other American POWs, and for the most part, they made it home. So they did eventually have, I think, about 1,000 Morrison Knudson people come home.
Why were the workers killed? Why were they treated so poorly in camps? How did the Japanese military view these men who were workers, not military?
So I think it's really clear. Again, they had planned to kill them at the very beginning. They weren't planning on taking prisoners. They weren't planning on on keeping these men alive because that was sort of the Japanese view of war. It was conquer. It was not. It was. It was. I can't use strong enough language in a podcast to talk about how it was not capturing the people. It was capturing land. It was, the supremacy of the Japanese people was around. So these other people weren't really people. They were less than. Um, the Japanese emperor was divined by God. These were his rules, and these people, again, they were just less than human. And so killing them was not like killing a real person. Um, they talked about in some POW camps, when they were doing some very dark work, they referred to them as logs, and they would talk about how many logs did you cut down today. And those are how many people did you kill. So it really wasn't, to them, it wasn't murder, it was cleanup. We want this island and it has all these things on it that we don't need, so we're going to get rid of it and clean it up. But then they realized, hey, we can use them. And it was tools, not people. These were tools to be used and discarded when they no longer had value. I'm sorry.
I know that is this is more emotional and heavy than I was expecting. I am wondering if the families back in Idaho, did they have any word during the war about who was alive, where they were, what was happening? I mean, did anyone escape to kind of report what happened?
Well, there was ongoing conversations happening between Japan and the US government. And there were sort of letters sometimes, there was sort of responses. There was someone who escaped, not once the island was occupied, but I think it was December 20th. So it was after the battle had started. There was like one working plane left, and someone was able to escape and give word. But generally, no one really escaped. That the closest there was, um, there was a few attempts to escape. They were caught. They were beaten. That person who wrote the 98. That's how we know there was 98 at the end. He wrote a message, the 98 rock. You might be familiar with that. He wrote that in the 2 weeks that he escaped. But again, you are an island, and it is an island far from anything, and so it was really hard to escape. Like, you couldn't really escape on your own. You have to have a way to get off the island, which was rare. And so escape wasn't really. They talked about it. Some of the diaries talk about how there's constant rumors of escape. There's constant rumors of rescue. There's, always all this talk. But even the diaries talk about how those whispers got monotonous because it was so hopeless.
So by and large, most Americans and the families in Idaho had no idea if their family member who worked for Morrison Knudson was alive or had perished, or even where they were.
They probably knew that they were alive. Because the majority of them did survive. Don't forget, of the, I think it was at the height. We don't know the exact numbers ever because it was such a big operation. There were constantly boats coming in and out, taking people on, taking people off. But total, we think there were about 1,218 civilians at the time of the attack. There were about 1,100 at the end of the attack, and there was about 180 who died in the course of the 2 years. So 180 of 1,200, you had good odds that your family member survived. But the Japanese weren't keeping good records. It was, again, those diaries and the other prisoners who were keeping those kind of records. And it's hard to say this. You can't put yourself in the mind of the people then. But as I commented before, the people who are higher up, the managers, the officers, were treated a little better. They also wrote letters and in their diaries that their treatment was better, that the Japanese weren't terrible to them, that they all went fishing together, and they had drinks together sometimes, all these things. And they were part of the communication that was going out, because the Japanese obviously read everything that was going out. They controlled that narrative very strongly. And so there's some thought that maybe they were purposefully, they being the Americans who were not talking in such extreme terms, that maybe they were doing so purposefully so that their messaging could get out. And so
Got you.
So some people did know like so and so passed away because they were able to tell those, but again, Japan was really clear on not telling the numbers of people who had passed away. They would sometimes save the numbers until there was another bombing raid and then say, oh, 22 people died in this bombing raid. It was 22 people over the previous time, things like that. Because in the same way America had the propaganda going about how brave these would be, Japan had the propaganda of how, they were so strong and those stupid Americans killing their own people.
Right. So it sounds like it was about 1,000 who returned home after the war. And I imagine that was a process over time of men returning back home. I wish we could see those reunions. That must have been really special.
Well, and it wasn't really that long a process because remember, it wasn't like there was a lot of flights or a lot of options. So there would be a lot of people on this boat and they would all arrive in, Seattle at the same time. And then they'd all be on the train together at the same time. And that train would arrive in this location and people knew when those trains were coming and they would be met in Idaho with cheers and welcome and congratulations
Oh,
and thanks.
yeah, wonderful to think about that. Did any of the workers share stories or write memoirs after they came home? Was it
They
talked about?
in general, World War II was not talked about in the way we think of it today because we're just things happen so fast. We have memoirs that come out the day people retire that they've been working on. But this was a trauma to the world, that we all went through this major war. And I don't think it was people's first instinct to write a memoir, especially for publication about what happened. So those things, it definitely came later. For example, for like Japanese Americans, they talk about how it wasn't until the next generation came along and said what happened that they started capturing the stories and releasing them. So there was a couple of things in the 1950s, some articles, some short stories type things. In the 70s, you had sort of this explosion of World War II memoirs because again, the next generation is writing them. But for this particular one, the only one I'm really aware of is Mace. Frank Mace wrote his memoir in 1990. So that's
Wow.
for some of our listeners, 1990 is a long time ago. For me, it seems like not that long, but that is 45 years after the event. He wrote his
Right.
memoir. Oh, it's terrifying to think that that was almost 35 years ago now. But whew, that was a long time after Wake Island that he actually had that come out. But they did have, like I said, those diaries and things like that. So there was material available. We had records that people kept, but I don't think were they weren't inclined. That generation, not just these Wake Island, but that generation was not one to unload their trauma in the form of a memoir like that.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
think a lot of these stories, they were, if family members asked, if people asked, and some of them became sort of legends or myths, or like I said, that someone calling out the emperor when they're all sitting there in the rain. We don't know who that was. We don't know if it really happened, but somebody said this and this. So even like the 98, we think it was 98. That's what's written on the stone. We know that the Japanese knew exactly how many people were there because they could count them and find that one was missing. But we're not entirely sure that that number is 100% accurate. And it's things we don't know if it was 2 weeks or if maybe the Japanese were saying different things. So it's it's really hard to have perfectly accurate information, especially when it was just such, I mean, it was a horror. It was just the worst conditions you could possibly imagine, 4 years that these men were going through. And so how would you even relate the worst thing you can imagine on paper? It makes sense that they wouldn't want to relive it. And even if they were inclined, how could you? How could you articulate something of that magnitude?
Absolutely. After the war, when everything was done, were any of the Japanese leaders who were on Wake Island and executed the 98, were any of them held accountable?
Yes, to some extent. So the treatment of Japanese military leadership after the war is always it's always a little bit fuzzy compared to the German leadership. I personally just think because we had fatigue at that point, the war had been going on a long time, and I think we all wanted to be done. So the trials and the work of that side was a little bit more it was a little quicker than like the Nuremberg trials, for example. But the two leaders, which would have been Sakibara um, and and one more, and Tachibana. Um, they were both sentenced to death for the massacre that happened. Um, they were so they were captured and sentenced to death. However, um, only one was given life imprisonment in 1947. His sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, but the other one was hanged in 1947, and the one who was hanged was the one uh, Sakebara, who he beheaded the prisoner, the last of the 98, and ordered their massacre to begin with, and he was put to death.
What about leaders in the POW camps? You described pretty horrific conditions there. Were any of those Japanese military leaders held accountable after the war?
I mean, I don't want to say that none of them were, but not in the way that German leaders were. You had a lot of really high military leaders in Japan who maintained power after the war. They some of them became like members of the Japanese Ministry of Japanese Diet, and even to this day, you can still see sort of the um, lingering shadows of some of these ideals. But there were several put to death. There were several who were imprisoned. There were several who again went on trial, but just not in sort of the televised ways of the Nuremberg trials.
Got you. We hinted earlier that the events on Wake Island really impacted how Idahoans felt about the war and felt about the Japanese in particular. Can you explain how those events on Wake Island impacted how Idahoans and Americans treated Japanese on our shores during the war?
We might need a whole other podcast for that one because that is a really
That's a big
it's a
question.
really big item, and it's also to me it's the question because we I say we Idaho was so unique in the war, and it's a really interesting because we weren't a coastal state, obviously, and we always think the coastal states had the highest population of Japanese, so they were most impacted. Um, but a lot of firsts and onlys in regards to internment and Japanese American treatment during the war happened in Idaho, and it happened because of these events. So the sort of the reason for that. So there's lots of things like I think there was only two occasions where people leaving internment where before they had to go to the concentration camps, the Japanese camps, they could leave the area. And there's only really two examples of people being stopped and imprisoned while they were traveling, and those are both in Idaho. There was only 2 examples of students being detained when they went to college, and only one of them was um, in the winter. One is in September. It's much later, but one was in March, and it was in Idaho. um, we had the governor saying that, Japanese are rats and we should put them all on their island and sink it into the ocean. And he was saying that in public spaces. Um,
We
and
should say too that there was, just in case our listeners don't know, there was a Japanese incarceration camp in Idaho, uh, at Minidoka near the Twin Falls area. We have recorded some context episodes about Minidoka, so I'll refer our listeners to learn more about that here. But so Idahoans were encountering Japanese Americans during the war.
they were, and that's really why this interesting dichotomy happened. So you had the governor, who was obviously under a lot of pressure while Wake Island battle is happening. He's under a lot of pressure while all these Idahoans are prisoners of war. Get our boys home. What are you doing to get our boys home? How are you interacting? But they were mostly from, like I said, the Treasure Valley. They were from the Boise area. They were from the metropolitan, the areas of the state. And so you had Moritz and Knudson, very wealthy, big people in the state, putting pressure on the governor. We hate Japanese people. That needs to be the message. Get our boys home. That's what we're doing. You go a little bit more south towards the Twin Falls, towards Minidoka, and this is now more agriculture area. And Japanese at the time were sort of the migrant farm workers of the age. A lot of the Japanese had come to America to work as farm workers. And so the sugar beet plantations in the south of Idaho depended on Japanese workers for their crops. And so you had this other political force of this agriculture movement saying, no, we're not going to say this about Japanese. Hey, governor, see all these people in Minidoka? You have to let them out because we need them to pull some beets for us. We have to have these workers, or we're all going to go fallow. No one's going to be able to pick these. And as gearing up for war, we need provisions. We need this done. And the people who do it, you have in a camp. And so you went from December of Pearl Harbor, 1941, and Wake Island. Again, they're rats. We're gonna sink them into the ocean. We hate all of them. You have Japanese students being arrested in March and April. You had people during the relocation process being detained. You had people with giant signs saying like "No Japs allowed." You had all this anti-Japanese rhetoric, and by the time the fall rolled around, they had been relocated to Minidoka and they were being let out of Minidoka to go work in the sugar beet fields because, and they, some of the agriculture people, some of the farmers expressed their gratitude to their Japanese compatriots for coming and doing that work under really difficult circumstances. Those Japanese Americans stepped up and put their labor towards this workforce. And so you have this really, really strange relationship to Japanese people in Idaho happening during this war.
It's also one of the bizarre twists of this really difficult part of our history that it was only Japanese Americans in certain coastal parts of the West Coast that were incarcerated, while Japanese Americans who were, like you said, living in interior states were not incarcerated. So I think that may have added some confusion and challenge to the situation as well.
Absolutely. I wrote my dissertation about these 6 Japanese students who were at the University of Washington, and then they went to the University of Idaho, and Idaho did not treat them well. They kicked them out. But then they went 11 miles over the border to the Washington State, and they hadn't gone there originally because nobody knew what those borders of relocation would be. They thought it might be the entire state of Washington. And so that's why they didn't go to WSU to begin with. And when Idaho kicked them out, they had nowhere to go, so they went that 11 miles over the border and continued their education at Washington State. And Washington State was fine, but UW was not because it was within the zone.
Right.
And it was literally, you know, dozens and dozens of different areas. It wasn't, one order we're making zones. It was they had maps and it was from this street to this street on this date, and then, oh, we're expanding it from this street to this. It was really hard to track and figure out in the moment. And it wasn't until later when the borders were really defined that we could say, oh, it was this area. No, people didn't know day to day if they were in a relocation zone or not. So it was definitely a time of confusion.
Rebecca, so many people in Idaho are not familiar with this history, not just Wake Island, but also Japanese incarceration. Could you speak a little bit about why this story matters so much, why it's important, and why it's an important part of Idaho's history?
I think it's a really important of Idaho's history because there's sort of a historical resonance that happens that we see the long shadow. There's a great book called The Long Shadow of Nikkei in America, and so it talks about how this event happened, and in the whole history of Idaho, this was only a few years, but it rings through history. I know my grandfather would rage about Japanese, and I never understood it. He had very choice words for the Japanese people, and then it seemed like on a dime sometimes would turn around and talk about Mr. Furukawa, his neighbor, who was his friend, and fought in the European campaign for the US, and how the US didn't treat Mr. Furukawa well after the war, and how unfair that was. And that's such a confusing dialectic that we don't try and dismantle, we don't try to discuss, we don't have these sort of minute conversations. And I think it's especially important for Idaho where I said I have trouble imagining someone in America not knowing about Pearl Harbor. I don't think most people know about Wake Island. And if you I say this to any Idahoans listening, if your family's from Idaho, look back, see if you have an uncle or a cousin. They might have been there. Somebody knew. Again, everybody knew each other. So everyone would have a story of, you know, Bill Wilcox went there and he had this experience and he never spoke about it again. But after he died, we found his papers and it was all this. And those stories exist in households in Idaho. They exist in families in Idaho, but they've never been discussed. And I think that that's really a shame because you see this sort of ongoing issue. I would say Idaho still has something of a reputation about not being the most diverse state, not being the most welcoming state, and sort of the reasoning isn't discussed. And if it's not discussed, how do we ever overcome? Like, how do we change? How do we know where we're going if we don't know where we are coming from?
I think sometimes people don't know how to really understand or come to understand complicated history. And that is so the story of Idaho. Why do we need to wrestle with this? Why do we need to know the good, the bad, the ugly about our
Yeah.
past?
Yeah. Well, it is the ugly. There's not a happy ending to the Wake Island story, even with most of them coming home. The stories that come from Wake Island do not have happy endings. They have stories of survival, but they're more stories of loss. Uh, Pearl Harbor, the movie Pearl Harbor is longer than the actual bombing campaign was. It's You talk about things being complex. You had the 2 weeks of actual invasion, which was bombing campaign, then ground invasion, then bombing. Then you had 2 years of terrible conditions and US bombing campaigns and flyovers and negotiations and all of this back and forth. And it is complicated. It's really complex. There's the mix of, again, the the monetary value of Morrison Knudson and how big a player it was in Idaho, and the work they were doing. How that was, again, it was an economic boom for Idaho, and it became this tragedy. And again, we were trying to have this really positive war effort happening, but the Morrison Knudson people weren't soldiers. So while they were POWs, they weren't drawing a salary like military persons will. So you had a lot of families that were going through even more economic hardships during the war because so you had the horror of I don't know where my loved one is. I don't know what's happening to them. I don't know the conditions they're in. And I don't know if I can feed my children tomorrow. I don't know what we will do to survive this war. I don't know if I'll ever see my husband again. And it's again, it's really not a happy story. And people like happy endings. They like stories of, you know, we all were okay in the end, or we all had this great moment. People survived, and that is the happiest we can say.
Rebecca, I want to thank you for joining me today and helping us learn more about this really important part of Idaho history, but also help us understand the value of wrestling with the ugly sides of our history. Thank you so much for the energy you've put into researching and writing about this.
Thank you so much for having me. It's like I said, it really revitalizes my love of this topic to be able to tell people about it and remember all these little minute parts that I can't always write about, but they make such good stories sometimes. So I'm really delighted to be able to tell people more about it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.